All right. Search for origins, search for pre-Christian origins, and what happens when that search for origins focuses on the finding of the drug and the phenomenology of the drug as the way to find the drug. So what I'm talking about is the claim that the ancient Eleusinian mysteries were psychedelic, as claimed by Carl Ruck and co-authors in The Road to Eleusis, 1978, and revitalized, as my colleague Dr. Greer mentioned, in Brian Morescu's The Immortality Key in 2020. And so these books attempt to shed light on the enigmatic rituals of the Eleusinian mysteries, arguing that the consumption of a psychoactive substance played a pivotal role in the rituals, which dramatized Persephone's underworld death rebirth journey, nested in the cosmic fractal cycles of destruction and creation. Okay, so these books are really popular, and they're very mainstream, and they're almost totally ignored by scholars. And I'm going to draw out something important about this reception and response history, so let me detail it a little bit. Until a couple of weeks ago, in response to the Immortality Key, for instance, I was only aware of one gray paper and the fact that both Dr. Charles Stang and I both independently presented papers on it in the summer of 2023. Mine was with my colleague, Dr. Richard Askoff. And Dr. Stang's excellent essay is now published in Harvard Theological Review, and there also recently appeared a new piece in Reason magazine. Otherwise, this psychedelic mysteries hypothesis was not being engaged in religious studies. There is some work on Road to Eleusis, not a lot. But I saw the claim that the ancient mysteries were psychedelic constantly repeated at psychedelic conferences. And I saw it especially on the slide of the presentations that gave the cultural historical background, and particularly the psychedelic science presentations included this slide. There would be the bas-relief of Demeter handing Persephone a mushroom, apparently, the alleged mushroom. And so seeing this all over the place, I wanted, and having colleagues always coming up to me going, did you know, you're in religion, you're a religious studies scholar, did you know that the ancient mysteries were psychedelic? It's like, there's not evidence for this. And so I thought, let me put this piece in a psychedelic science journal to speak particularly to that crowd. And the Psychedelic Science Journal did not want to critique Ruck and Wasson and Hoffman, and seem to undermine some of the bedrock on which rests the popularization of psychedelics and the dignification of psychedelics as old and religiously serious, and on which therefore rest certain arguments for the legalization of psychedelics. So after a year of back and forth, we tried to publish it in a religious studies journal that after another year turned out didn't want to touch psychedelics. Okay, so this publication non-history or non-publication history is emblematic of a larger problem. The siloing of academic disciplines and academia from popular discourse means that sometimes an idea gets picked up, like the psychedelic mysteries claim from a classicist, and then it gets repeated in another discipline, psychedelic science work, but it's then insulated from getting evolved by interdisciplinary critique. So the contribution that I want to make is towards supporting the discussion of psychedelics coming into mainstream culture on sound historical footing, and to emphasize drawing on sophisticated frameworks for working with the psychedelic experience rather than the finding of the drug and the phenomenology of the drug. And I want to foreground the importance of scholars bringing our subjectivity to the claims that we are making, which for all of the talk of positionality becoming de rigueur in the academy, it's not exactly often that academia trains us to make a practice of inventorying what we've disowned and avoided knowing about ourselves and projected onto others or the past and so on, in order to continually come into integrity around what we're doing. But our work is deeply served by inquiring into what our come from is with it. So what stands out for me with the psychedelic mysteries hypothesis is the strength of the desire to have a Western civilizational pedigree. to dignify the use of stigmatized drugs. Other psychedelic histories don't seem to do it. Other non-drug modes of changing consciousness. The Eleusis discourse is very focused on mushrooms and acid and aligning with an older and truer religion. Now, the come from is an understandable defense against anti-drug attitudes. There's a case making by appealing to ancient authority, speaking back to anti-drug authority today, saying, drugs aren't going to fry my brain, they shouldn't be illegal, real religion is about drugs, and it feels ecstatic, and you've kept the good stuff from me, and now I'm going to take it back. Okay, don't mishear me. There is nothing wrong with looking to the past and wanting to know what is there. There's nothing wrong with wanting to inquire about Western psychedelic histories. That's valuable. The growth edge in this psychedelic mysteries discourse is, instead of appealing to ancient authorities to create a normative landscape that can hold rather than wage war on psychedelics, to become grounded in and advocating for one's own experiences and values and practices. So hear this critique not as a dismissal of the inquiry into ancient psychedelics, but as being about what to emphasize and the importance of a grounded, centered come from to integrate toward. All right, so what happens when we focus on finding the drug in history and finding that drug through a phenomenological comparison of this is what I think this drug felt like to me now, and this description in an ancient text sounds like what I felt like, and so therefore that's probably this drug. What happens when that happens? It means that it focuses on the task of that finding and the phenomenology that authorizes the linkage, rather than a program of creative work for taking up an injunction in the psychedelic space from spirit, from the divine, from the higher truth, from personal and human potential, from a deeper level of consciousness, however you model it. And so again, hear this as a matter of emphasis, not a dismissal of studying phenomenology. I'm talking about what happens when a discourse focuses on the drug per se, rather than what is the work that you do once it gets you into a state. And how do we model the parameters and the ends of spiritual evolution, of God waking up in form, of connecting with the fundamental waveform of the universe that might be best described in human terms as love. Thank you, Jim Fadiman, for that amazing phrase. However you model it, that work. Okay, so in brief, how this plays out in Road to Eleusis, for example, is that the authors present a case for the use of ergot, ritually drunk at the ceremony to peak at the climax of the Hierophant's drama. And Wasson, Hoffman, and Ruck write that given the size of the audience, thousands, and their reactions, it, quote, seems obvious that an hallucinogen must have induced it, end quote. And this sort of thing is, thank you, repeated frequently throughout the book. So they make this assumption based on their interpretation of the phenomenology of psychedelics, specifically of ergot, a source of LSD precursors, but which they assume felt like a mushroom trip. And Wasson writes, I am certain that this word ecstasy came into being to describe the effect of the mystery of Eleusis. Can you find a better word than that to describe the bemushroomed state? Okay, so we have this claim that experiences described in the ancient texts, which are few, obviously fit with modern psychedelic experiences, and the focus is on finding the drug using the phenomenology. The problem is that it's underwriting a cultural container for psychedelic practice being forwarded through biomedical therapeutic mainstreaming by gesturing to an uncertain history based on a phenomenological comparison and circumstantial evidence, absent of modeling of the gnosis and the practical modeling of the processes for working with it, integrating the eternal potential into the temporal manifest of daily life. And in this space, some philosophers have attempted to introduce secular resources for this modeling, such as Peter Sjostich Hughes's metaphysical matrix, and I've tried to do something similar with modeling experiences, particularly of evil and suffering, which appeared in this wonderful collection that came out of last year's CSWR Psychedelic Intersections Conference. So my final remark is to the extent that what frames the West's cultural historical resources for psychedelic practice is an attempt to authorize it by finding drugs in the past by way of phenomenological identification, then those coming to psychedelics through this route are learning form over content. And what they really need is bodybuilding for the disclosure, and to know that the divine disclosure is not one ceremony in the telesterion. It is a lifetime of successive, increasingly subtle deepening. Thank you.